So I'm going to do something a bit different today. I'm going to stray quite a long way off the theme. I think I've already said everything I have to say about the theme in question time. I've got nothing left at all to say. There should be no mystery about what my view is about we are our brains. So instead I'm going to address a question about the impact of cognitive science more generally. I never talk about neuroscience narrowly, but always cognitive science, because functional stuff tends to come more from neuropsychology and cognitive psychology and social psychology than cognitive neuroscience still, although that's changing. The way in which cognitive science can actually illuminate our responsibility, particularly for actions we perform without consciousness. So that's enough of an intro. Okay, so there's since the automaticity revolution in psychology, we found out more and more about the power of non-conscious processes in the brain to drive behavior, and sometimes in ways that are incredibly complex. For example, sending emails in their sleep. 2004 case report, a woman who sent 3 emails which were somewhat understandable in her sleep while sleepwalking. They also sometimes do morally relevant things. For example, 2 cases just last month in the UK, one an acquittal, one a conviction. In both cases, males charged with rape. In both cases, they pleaded somnambulism. In one case, they were successful. These are pathological cases, these are unusual cases, but we all act in ways that are driven by either unconscious information in our brains or responding to information external to our brains of which we're not conscious, or the effects of which we're not conscious. For example, this study I like, I don't have time to tell you about it right now, people confabulated criteria of merit in order to justify a sexist preference for a male over a female applicant, but what they were conscious of wasn't the sexist preference, but the confabulated criteria of merit. So the question is, in both these pathological cases and in these normal cases, which are ubiquitous, are these agents, are we morally responsible for the behaviour? I'm going to focus on a Canadian case to answer this question. Ken Parks is a quite famous case. Ken Parks stabbed both his parents-in-law, pleaded not guilty on the grounds non-insane automatism is the legal defense. Jennifer can tell you a lot more about it than I can. He was successful. He was convicted. He was acquitted by the lower court and the Canadian Supreme Court. On the grounds he was not conscious, and there's lots of evidence that he was not conscious. But you might think the courts clearly followed the law properly in this case. They applied the law correctly. There's no doubt that he was not guilty by reason of non-insane automatism. But you might say, is the law correct, given how complex his behavior is? This is a man who drove 23 kilometers in a state of somnambulism. You may think, I'm not sure ambulism is quite the right sense, the word there, but you might say, well, given we can do so much and such complex behaviours while not conscious, maybe the law is wrong and we should simply hold people responsible for this kind of behaviour. It's true we are capable of very complex behaviours in these pathological states like somnambulism and absence seizures, but behaviours are very far from normal. This woman here, this is a surveillance picture taken by her husband of her sleep eating. She ate I don't know what you call them here, we call them Brillo pads. One night she had that as her late night snack. Another woman made herself a cat food sandwich. A third woman put used cigarette butts and milk in a blender and drank the result. So the behaviors can be very, very complex, like making a sandwich, but they're very far from normal. Much less dramatically, people in absence seizures in particular, we know a lot more about this than other cases, but also somnambulism, the behavior is characteristically inflexible and stereotyped. So for example, there are several case reports of people who have undergone absence seizures while playing the piano. Apparently it's audible in the playing. They continue to play, but they play without expression. It becomes mechanical. There are several case reports, again mainly absence seizures, of people who've experienced these seizures while driving. They drive only on familiar routes. No matter where they were going, they end up back at home. But they drive safely, but in an inflexible and stereotyped way. So we need to explain two things. How can people perform such complex behaviors in states that are either complete absence of consciousness or possibly there's a little bit of neural evidence here. There's no doubt that's a pathology of consciousness. It may be a severely degraded state of consciousness. So how is it that people can perform such complex behaviors in these states? But why is it, on the other hand, that there are characteristic limitations of this behavior? So now I'm going to try and answer that. Some background. In some sense of modularity, I think a modularity thesis is uncontroversial. There are other senses of modularity in which it's highly controversial, but in a weak sense it's uncontroversial. In a weak sense, to say the mind is modular is to say that it consists of nothing but discrete and dissociable processing units. Many of which are encapsulated in one sense of encapsulation. They respond to information that falls within a particular domain and are completely insensitive to information outside that domain. Under some conditions you can see encapsulation in action in normal subjects. Here's one. These squares, A and B, are the same color. I think that's a stunning visual illusion. I can't see those as the same color. If you Google the checkerboard illusion, you can bring it up on your screen, cut out a little square to just match the size of those squares, and then you can see for yourself that they're the same color. The other thing you can do is to look at what the pixels are actually being used. You can check it on your Mac and it'll tell you the hue and saturation, and you'll see they're identical. But we can't see them as identical. Why? Because the visual system, or parts of the visual system, are encapsulated, which is to say that if they can't respond to the information, these squares are identical. They continue to do their thing, they continue to produce their output, despite the fact that you now know that they're the same color. Most of the time we're unaware of the encapsulation of modules. Most of the time it doesn't matter for all practical purposes. Why? Because we're capable of domain general reasoning. That's reasoning that responds to any information, even though our mind consists of nothing but domain-specific processes. So there's a puzzle, there's a prima facie puzzle. How do we get domain general reasoning in a mind that consists of nothing but domain-specific processes? Here's a stunningly unoriginal claim. Consciousness is an important part of the answer to that question. Consciousness provides a medium whereby information is shared across brain processes. As I say, there's nothing original about this claim. This is the global workspace theory of consciousness, which again is uncontroversial. In some anodyne form of it, it's uncontroversial. People sometimes think it's controversial. That's because they're loading more into it than I want to load into it. We even know something about the neural basis of the global workspace. It's thalamocortical loops, which allow the sharing of information between executive processes and the front of the brain and places where information is stored more towards the back of the brain. So when people act without consciousness, they're not capable of integrating all the information to which their behavior may nevertheless respond. Behavior is driven by modular processes which respond only to narrow sets of information, or by what I call an action scripts, where an action script is an acquired set of motor representations, like the action scripts involved in, excuse me, in driving a car. These are overlearned, habitual sets of movements of the hands, but also scanning for certain characteristic pieces of information, and so on. We can see behavior being driven by action scripts in otherwise rational subjects under some conditions, some pathological conditions. For example, utilization behavior. This is consequent on traumatic brain injury, in which people respond to what's called the affordances of objects without being able to inhibit that response. The affordance of a hat is you put it on. People's utilization behavior, if you put a hat in front of them, they put it on. You put a second hat in front of them, they put that on. And they tend to confabulate reasons for why they're doing it. Or in the alien hand, this usually follows stroke. This woman in the image is hitting herself. She's actually had a operation for intractable epilepsy, and she's got alien hand. Her hand is hitting her. The hand is not under the control of the person, but it responds to affordances. It doesn't move at random. It doesn't just jerk spasmodically. It hits you, it takes food and puts it in your mouth, it undoes buttons and so forth. This is all examples of actions driven by scripts or modular processes. And we see the same thing in normal subjects in the relative absence of consciousness. For example, driving while distracted. You can turn your driving over to your action scripts for driving relatively safely. A, because they're pretty good at it. B, because if there's an emergency, you're immediately all your conscious attention will be brought to bear, because you have scripts for that too, for alerting yourself to unusual situations requiring conscious reflection. So I think we can now explain how Ken Parks was able to get up off his sofa all the way to his parents-in-law house and let himself in. All of that can be driven by action scripts. What he didn't have was an action script for violent behavior. If he did, I suspect the courts would have been a lot more reluctant to acquit him. In fact, he had no history of violence and no motive was part of the reason why they're willing to acquit him. I suspect that the violence is caused by somnambulism, easily becomes another parasomnia called sleep terror, which may be a conscious state. When the person reacts as though in a nightmare. It's controversial whether that's a conscious state. I'm going to assume that even if it is a conscious state, it's not conscious of, it's not able to integrate facts about the environment. So what should we say about his moral responsibility? Well, his behavior is driven by modules or action scripts. It's not driven by the person as a whole, because who you are is constituted by your values and beliefs and desires and goals and so forth, which are broadly distributed. You driving your behavior when all of that stuff or enough of that stuff is online, not when some narrow set of that process is online. Another way to get at the same conclusion is just to realize that he's not able to respond to a variety of cues which would be sufficient to inhibit his behavior under other circumstances. For example, his mother-in-law's face, the sight of the blood, screams, all of those things he's not able to integrate because he doesn't have action scripts to integrate them, and given the absence of consciousness, it's only via some kind of modular process or some kind of action script he can respond to them. So his behavior is not responsive to those cues. So I think the court's got it right. It's not sufficiently expressive of who he is, and it's not sufficiently controlled by him. So what about ordinary people? Ordinary people, in, bless you, in say in Ullman and Cohen's experiments, or in all those many dozens, hundreds of experiments, implicit attitudes, in a way implicit attitudes, bias processing in various ways to produce racist or sexist behavior or homophobic behavior. Most of us have implicit attitudes that are biased against minorities and against women. The lowest figure I've ever seen comes from Payne's lab, which is just over 50%. So it's a pressing question. Are we responsible for the behaviors driven by such attitudes? In these cases, the behavior is not driven just by action scripts. Obviously, a lot of behavior is driven by action scripts under all conditions, but it's not driven just by action scripts, and it's not driven just by modular processes. But nevertheless, there's still the same kind of failure to be able to integrate relevant information into the global workspace and therefore to respond to it as a reason. So, for example, in the Ullman and Cohn experiment, what we're conscious of is the confabulated criteria of merit and not the reasons why we confabulate those criteria of merit, precisely because we're not conscious of that. So we assess the plausible seeing criteria of merit in light of our values and so forth, and fail to assess the fact that it has a sexist content in the light of our values because we're not conscious of it. Again, the decisions seem to be neither expressive of nor controlled by the agent. To see they're not expressive of it, you can imagine that the agent is a feminist who wants to hire the woman. And she may say to herself, I'd really like to give the job to the woman, but what can I do? The man is just clearly better qualified. Unable to see that the fact that she takes the man to be better qualified is the result of the implicit attitude which biases her in characteristic ways. So it doesn't seem like, by hypothesis, she's a feminist. It doesn't seem like the choices reflect expressive of who she is, nor does she control the fact that it has a sexist content. In both cases, it's direct responsibility that's at issue. We could be indirectly responsible. Maybe we can change our implicit attitudes. Maybe we can, sorry, I moved to the slide. Maybe we can bypass them in various ways, for example, by blinding ourselves to the gender of job applicants. Maybe if we're prone to somnambulism, there are certain things we should do. There could be grounds for indirect responsibility, but I think we're not directly responsible for the behaviors driven by unconscious attitudes or unconscious responses to information. Thank you.